everyone with us today. Thank you very much. And, today is the second to last presentation. Chris Mitchell is going to be talking about successful partnerships and business models today, and I'll introduce him in a moment. Then next week, we've got looks like a very interesting presentation around local government powers to do broadband in Tennessee. And it's amazing how different every state is. And so in Illinois, our presentations on this were quite short, because unless you were a home rule county, which is like 2 or 3 counties in Illinois, powers are virtually very limited to assume debt to participate in a project. Tennessee, it looks like you have to do some wrangling to make it happen, but certainly possible. So, but today is about models that you can, I just encourage you to listen to them. And I think I said early on in this program, the worst thing you can ever say when you're meeting with a provider is to say, we just don't want to be an ISP, because that's the last kind of arrow in your quiver when you want to think about making broadband happen in your community. And if you give that up too soon, too easy, just gives a range of comfort to the providers, incumbent providers in particular, that that you won't solve your own problem. And so I think it's always good to hold that in reserve. And I think one of the models Chris talks about today in Renville and Sibley counties, a very rural ag corn and bean country in central Minnesota. I attended multiple public meetings where person after person got up and said, well, I'm a conservative, but that but was we're going to take care of our own problems if we have to, and they certainly have. And so, but there's a lot of other ways to participate in a community broadband project without being an ISP, and Chris is going to talk about those. So Chris Mitchell is head of the Broadband Initiative of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is a very long-standing and interesting organization that really focuses on community empowerment through better economies and local ownership of those local economies. And we all talk about shopping locally and spending locally, and kind of the, I would say, some ways the romantic notion of the small rural community, but there's a lot of ways that Chris and his organization on retailing and on energy and on broadband and just general shopping. Chris does not have an Amazon account, so I don't think you can have one if you work at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And so there's a philosophy there that you build your economy from within and keep your money in your town as long as possible. And that's not a new idea. That's kind of Blaine would say, well, that's what our Chamber of Commerce does in Monroe County. And so Chris's organization is all about that. But Chris has been a national speaker at, he's definitely an A-list presenter at all the national conferences, and has really been an innovator at helping local communities become more self-sufficient in broadband. Chris, welcome.
Thank you, Bill. I don't want to contradict you immediately, but I'll say I actually do have an Amazon account, and the woman who is my boss, Stacy Mitchell, who runs the program and is one of the chief people that is working to make sure that Amazon faces real competition and doesn't just get to set all the rules. She is a Prime member, which I'm not, and she loves the video that they have. We do not believe in a politics of purity in any way. We're about what gets done, and you used the term romantic, local rural economies, and I'll just say that if you ask my wife, I am the least romantic person on this planet, unfortunately. We try to focus on what works, and I know that you know that about us. How long did you want me to speak before we break into Q&A fully?
Why don't we go 30 minutes or so?
Okay. All right. I will do my best.
Or 40.
No. 30 is what I'll aim for.
All righty.
Excellent. So I'm excited. I've spent a fair amount of time in East Tennessee and less time elsewhere in Tennessee, but I'm deeply familiar with some of the networks and partnerships that have gone on. I'm going to do kind of a surface level of Tennessee and talk more generally, but in the Q&A, I'm happy to get in a little bit deeper where I know some things. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and let's see. I think you can see that now.
Yep.
Looks
Excellent.
good.
Thanks. So the place that I like to start is always just to note that you shouldn't have to be an expert in this stuff to be able to talk about it. I worked in energy policy before I got into broadband 16 years ago, and I still don't know what an amp is. I don't much care. I don't know what a volt is. I've read it multiple times, and it doesn't stick with me. I could really go deep on megabits and things like that. I'm very technical in that regard, but you don't have to be to work on this policy. You can have opinions about electricity, water systems, and other things without being an expert in it. And I think that is the correct way to deal with policy in an open society such as ours. So I just want to note that I'll talk about things like megabits, but I don't think you need to be an expert in it to be speaking about it, to know that we need to get everyone high quality service. It needs to work all the time. It needs to be affordable and that sort of a thing. So I like to put that in context to start. My organization is 50 years old. We are a deeply technical organization, and we try to skirt the line between working in state and federal policy, as well as working at the local level. So we're often a bridge between the two. And that's important to us because we're a bit annoyed at groups that aim to be experts on this, but never actually talk to the people doing the work and never actually do the work themselves. So we try to spend a lot of time in the field working directly with local governments and ISPs that are doing this work and trying to really understand how this stuff comes together. We write about these issues on a daily basis. We run a website called community.org.
I feel like I don't know what to do, and I've been kind of holding off until you have told us what to do.
Taking care of, cool. I'll just keep going. So we write about this on a near daily basis on communitynets.org. We try to let people know what's happening around the country. 10 years ago, we're the only ones really covering this stuff, but there's a lot of good news sources now that are covering it in greater depth. But we still have, I think, a context that we can provide that a lot of other folks cannot. We run something called the ACP dashboard, which I'm guessing you've talked about before, the Affordable Connectivity Plan. We try to put together every 2 weeks, we update it with the latest numbers to show how much money is left, what's the spend rate in each locality, what is the percentage of people who are signed up, who are eligible as best we can tell, and that sort of a thing. So that's something that we also link to a lot of other resources around the Affordable Connectivity Program. And then the last bit of self-promotion, perhaps, I mean, I can always find ways to shovel more in, but we do a lot of broadband related multimedia content. Working on another one of our, we do short films about broadband and community networks, as well as several podcasts. Our Community Broadband Bits show is approaching 600 episodes when you count the bonus ones. Been doing it for more than 10 years. We have another one that's focused on more digital equity in terms of what people are doing in the field to help teach skills and distribute devices. And then we have a show that we fondly call Connect This, which actually airs later this afternoon. It's about every 2 weeks. It features Doug Dawson, who sometimes is a presenter on the Accelerate program. Doug is deeply knowledgeable and has consulted with more than 1,000 ISPs over his career. Kim McKinley runs one of the larger community fiber networks, and Travis Carter runs a network in Minneapolis, a privately owned fiber company. And so we just try to go in depth and have some fun with it each week to cover the news. Now, we talk about community networks. I feel like people want to assume that this is kind of like a niche thing. And in some ways it is. Majority of the US population does not have access to community fiber. However, a majority of North America does by landmass, because this model covers a majority of the land, thanks to the rural telephone and electric cooperatives that have provided essential infrastructure for many decades in sparse areas across North America. And so we think this map is important to demonstrate that this is a model that gets stuff done. If you look at the area a little northwest of where I am in Minnesota, that area of North Dakota, South Dakota, and in Montana, the telephone cooperatives have done amazing work over the past 15 years to get people connected. And I think it's important to highlight that, because if you run into people who say, this can't get done, it's too hard or whatever, which I hope you're not hearing in Tennessee. I mean, the history of electrification in Tennessee is pretty impressive. We will get this done. The question of whether people are connected is not a question of technology. It's not even really a question of the difficulty of building it. It's a question of political power and where we are spending the great resources of this great nation. So we have built it in very high cost areas in Western Colorado, in the Rockies. We can build it out to nearly every home in Tennessee, I'd say, that's on the grid. If you got an electric line, it will be cheaper to build a fiber line to that home than it was to build the electric line. Electricity is expensive compared to fiber, something we could talk more about in the Q&A if people are interested. But there's a lot of different approaches, and this data is 2 or 3 years old, so it's actually even more significant. Like, significant parts of Mississippi are not represented here, and Georgia that are getting the technology now that isn't even listed on this map. So this is a cause for recognizing we will get it done. Everyone will have high quality internet access in the United States eventually. Doing the work that you're doing means that you'll be getting it sooner than some of the others who may have to wait another 10 or 15 years. Now, the Tennessee Electric Co-ops, before I really go deep into the partnerships, a little bit of context for Tennessee. This is based on our research, and I would say this is somewhere between preliminary and final. I just asked my team that's doing this to get me top line numbers on Tennessee based on their recent surveys. So there's 21 rural electric cooperatives that are serving homes and businesses, which is to say we're ignoring the G&T. And 13 of them already have fiber to the home projects that are connecting people. It looks like there's another 1 or 2 that either are about to announce or at least doing their kind of research that suggests to us that they'll be doing something in the future. They are all doing fiber for a substantial core, and then some are using wireless in edge conditions. That might be outside their territory or just in the edges where they have not yet had the subsidies that may be necessary to build the highest cost areas. Nearly all of them, I think only one of them is not clearly offering a gigabit tier, which is to say the highest capacity that is commonly available and commonly used across the United States. Some of the partnerships that we had come across involve the electric cooperative partnering with a telephone cooperative or some sort of subsidiaries in between. There's a lot of subsidiary action in Tennessee where there's different joint actions and things like that. But those are some different examples, and there are a lot of stories all over. You could easily find them if you Google these names and broadband or fiber or something like that. So there's a lot of action because the Tennessee legislature relaxed many of the restrictions on the cooperatives providing service. I want to say maybe 6 years ago now, something like that. Previously, the state had maintained significant restrictions against cooperatives providing broadband service. And the state continues to have significant restrictions against municipal service of networks, and that's something we can talk more about later as well.
Chris,
yes.
Just go back to the previous slide. So you have 3 of 4 counties here who are working with Duck Electric and United Communications, Fort Loudon Electric, and Powell Valley Electric. So just so you know, that's people are represented, and there are representatives from those firms in some of the groups here. Okay,
terrific. So I am not an expert on any of these. Oddly enough, AEC is the one I know a little bit better than the others. So what I would say about that is that one of the things that I found in talking with electric cooperatives is that cities and towns may think about partnering with them in ways that can help them achieve their goals, but you have to recognize some of the challenges that they face. In that, I don't know whether all of these counties are fully covered by those electric cooperatives. I suspect there may be a mix. And so for an electric cooperative to start connecting people outside of its members can be a political challenge, because its existing members will want to know, why are you spending money in areas that are not directly benefiting the members? However, it may be advantageous to connect areas where you have additional grant money or there's greater density, in order to improve the business case and the business, like the returns, the revenues of the project, that will then make it easier to connect lower density, higher cost areas. And so I think that is something that is worth keeping in mind when you're talking with the electric cooperatives, is to understand, I guess, first of all, that the number one thing that they do is electricity, and that's very important to them. They're never going to put that at risk. But when it comes to broadband, there can be some interesting partnerships that may allow them to build to non-member areas, as long as that's, I'm not entirely remembering exactly what the limitations are, if any, from the state. I don't remember if there's still a leftover that they can't offer certain services in their non-electricity territories. But helping them to make the case to their members that that will strengthen their business case to be able to serve everyone is a key part of the messaging to make a partnership like that work, in my experience. This is a similar map that just gives you a different sense of the community networks. Rather than everywhere they serve, it's just one pin per community network. There's a lot of different approaches that you can find. If you go to that link, you can sort them in different ways and show different things. The red states are the states that at that point had restrictions on municipal broadband. Since then, Arkansas and Washington both removed their restrictions on municipal broadband. There's been an effort in Tennessee to remove their restrictions. However, I would say AT&T and Comcast are very powerful in the legislature, the General Assembly, and so the state of Tennessee has not removed its restrictions. Arkansas was fascinating because it was unanimous. A heavily conservative state rejected the arguments of the cable and telephone companies and said, we need to make sure that communities have the ability to make their own decisions and move forward boldly in removing those restrictions. But we have not seen that dynamic elsewhere. So each state is indeed unique when it comes to these legislative discussions. Now, a quick moment to talk a little bit about what Chattanooga did. Chattanooga, I think, is one of the best networks in the world, and I know a bit about the world. I'm more of an expert in the United States, but regularly checking out what's happening around the world. And Chattanooga is something special, not just in the United States, but more broadly. It wasn't the first to be doing this service in Tennessee, but it has come on strong and really taken it seriously. But what is important to know, in Chattanooga, they'll claim, and the next slide will talk about this, there's academic research to suggest that they have created a benefit of $2.7 billion in the Hamilton County area and surrounding areas where Chattanooga serves electricity. $2.7 billion over 10 years from the benefits of that network. And people will automatically think that's because of the fiber optics. But I just want to note that Chattanooga uses the same technology that almost everyone else does. They get it from the same vendors. It's not particularly special. What is special about Chattanooga is how they use it. It is that they are focused on community benefits. They want to create local jobs. They want to make sure that everyone can benefit from it. That's what makes Chattanooga or the other community networks like Morristown, Bristol, Jackson, whatever you want to talk about. They're different because of their mindset and how they use the technology, not just because they have the technology. Don't get seduced by thinking that the technology is everything in this. It's really about how you use it once you got it. So, Chattanooga, when the pandemic hit, immediately started working with local philanthropy, and at a very reasonable cost of a few $1 million, I want to say probably like $6 to $8 million, was able to roll out free, high-quality internet access to thousands of families. I think now 10,000 families have signed up under a program in which they get free internet service if they're in the free and reduced lunch program in Hamilton County schools. So that's the sort of thing that can be done because they have ownership of the network. and because they're creative in how they go about doing things. They have the study that I mentioned regarding the $2.7 billion in benefits. Bento Lobo, a professor at UT Chattanooga, you can look that up pretty easily to find it. And then they are doing some more interesting things with community health and telehealth now as well in I think it's the Orchard Knob neighborhood. And that's just sort of a sense of like your journey will not be over when you get the high quality connectivity. There's still a lot of work that will have to be done. And I think even if you're not going to use a model that's similar to Chattanooga, you can still learn from what they've done. And I think it's worth getting a sense of that. Deb Sosha at the Enterprise Center, very open with her time, loves sharing information. I consider her to be, one of our real experts in the nation on a lot of this stuff. So highly recommend reaching out to her. Community networks are controversial, and so I get defensive about them sometimes. And so it's worth noting that we like to do research because, as I said before, I'm not romantic about local economies. We care about communities thriving. And so we want to do what works. If communities building broadband networks is actually as bad as the cable and telephone companies say, if it was a drag on the economy, if it was a wasted investment, we would not encourage communities to do that after they did their homework. And I always want to be clear, we want communities to do their homework before doing these things. But when we look for evidence that these models have succeeded, we find it all over the place. One of the examples is the fastest ISPs in the nation, as ranked by PC Magazine. Every year they do this, and every year we see a similar result where the top 10 networks in the nation have some small number of municipal networks. In this case, it's the dark blue ones. Next light is Longmont, Colorado. EPB is Chattanooga, and CFU is Cedar Falls Utilities in Iowa. Those are 3 of the top 10 ISPs in the nation in terms of their speed tests and that sort of a thing. Now, the other ones in the top 10, they are usually private companies that are more nimble, local, and each of them has, in part of their footprint, partnerships with local governments. So we thought that was worth highlighting. Like, these are models that work and that work at a very high level. Not every municipal network is the top 10 in the nation, obviously. Not every partnership results in amazing speeds and affordable pricing, but it works out generally well. It generally meets the needs when you put the serious work behind it that needs to be done in terms of generating local economic development, stabilizing prices, and making sure that everyone has service. So this paper, if you look carefully, you'll see it's now 8 years old, 7 years old, and we continue to look to it because the lessons have not changed significantly over what you want to think about in going into public-private partnerships with other ISPs. Public-private partnerships are sexy. Everyone wants to do them. It's something that, no one can be against a public-private partnership. And so people want to define everything as public-private partnerships. One of the things that we talk about in this paper is the need to have balance between the risks and the benefits. In a public-private partnership, the community should have some level of risk and it should have some measure of the upside. If you don't have that balance, it might be still something worth doing, but I would be careful and cautious. The private provider that you're working with or public provider, there can be other kinds of partnerships, should have some level of risk as well as measure of the upside as well. We also talk about other things such as having like an escape clause kind of thing, or a benefit that if something goes wrong, you have the first right of refusal to buy the network. We talk about why that's important, where it's been exercised. But you should expect that if you're working with a partner, that partner will change names, be bought out, or have some other significant change. Now, if you're working for an electric co-op, probably not. Those are pretty stable. But in the private sector, the ISPs change their names quite a bit. So don't be surprised if these things change, and you should have a plan for how to have a seat at the table when ownership changes in your partner's incentives. When it comes to public-private partnerships, sometimes they don't involve public money, sometimes they do. When they involve public money, sometimes it is borrowing that actually does not really impact the taxpayer or the ratepayer, and sometimes it does. In this small township in Michigan, they decided to tax themselves in order to build a network. And they had a popular vote, and it passed. It passed very supportively, like overwhelmingly. And then a neighboring township wanted to do it, and they had very similar demographics, although they had much more coordinated opposition from the incumbent existing provider, and they did not pass it. So, we can see similar votes going different ways based on the year and the sentiments. But even in deeply conservative areas, we see people voting to raise their taxes to build these networks under different circumstances. Similarly, we see people in more liberal areas not wanting to use their taxpayer dollars in this way. So I wouldn't take common political beliefs too seriously when you're evaluating these plans. Local politics matters a lot. Bill foreshadowed this. RS Fiber is, I think, an inspirational approach, not because they've had the kind of runaway success that Chattanooga has, but because they didn't, and it was still worth it. They've had significant challenges along the way. They originally wanted to do a municipal joint powers agreement among different communities in the county, and that did not work. So they turned it into a cooperative, and that was successful. They're one of very few examples of brand new cooperatives starting, although there appears to be another example of this down in East Carroll Parish in Louisiana. So it's not one and done. There may be some other examples, but they do require a lot of community education. This report really covers the model that they used and the education system that they used to get out there and get people excited about it. More than 100 community meetings across the 10 or 12 towns that they had for this. They had a real dedicated group that ran this, and it's a very impressive service. I can talk more about that if people are interested, but I want to spend all my time on it right now. Now, Vermont has an interesting approach. The entire state of Vermont has embraced municipal local ownership with generally a partnership of operation. Most often that's going to be a private company, it looks like, a local company in most cases operating the network that is owned by the cities, or in this case, the towns in Vermont. Vermont is a deeply rural area, the most rural state by the measure of people that don't live in metropolitan areas. So it is a difficult place to build. They have embraced this model of aggregating towns together, and then the state helps them with seed funding, and then they will be expected on the strength of their business plan to be able to get later funding in order to keep it going with local ownership and private operation in a partnership arrangement, a lease basically. Public-private partnerships can also be more loosey-goosey. I talk often about an operator that is all over North Carolina, someone who I have close connections with. They call it open broadband. Their partnerships may consist of sort of a handshake to get on the water tower, and then prioritizing some number of customers that the community wants to make sure is connected at an affordable rate. We see more formal and less formal approaches to this with particularly wireless operators. I tend to think of this still as kind of a shorter term play, getting people that service, saying this is a really high cost area. Ultimately, we want to have a solution that may not be wireless, that might be more comprehensive and can ensure that everyone has service. But over the next 5 years, we got to get them something. So we're going to get some wireless towers up, and we're going to do the best we can. Not unreasonable. I don't think it's a 20-year solution generally, but it is something that is a heck of a lot better than saying hold tight for 5 years and then we'll figure out what we have going on. Now, some of the big companies have gotten more involved with public-private partnerships. Not as many of the ones that are active in Tennessee, though. For instance, AT&T, Comcast, Charter, we do not see them doing any kind of innovative public-private partnerships, but some of their rivals have. And in the case of Springfield, Missouri, they have partnered with CenturyLink. To be clear, that was many years ago. That network is complete, seems to be a success. CenturyLink is not going around trying to get more of these deals, as best we can tell. So not exactly sure what's happening internally, but there does seem to be a split in some of these companies like Windstream, perhaps Frontier, where there is some people who want to pursue these partnerships and others don't. This is something that will change over time potentially. The big cable companies have not wanted to do partnerships in general. But in many of these cases, the community builds out some level of fiber infrastructure and then hands it off on a lease arrangement to the provider. In these three examples, it is non-exclusive. And so a city is making a significant commitment to build the network, or it could be a county as well. I know that Google Fiber has pursued this same deal with counties, and that includes non-urban counties. The deal is basically that about 40 to 50% of the cost of the fiber network would be paid for over 20 years through a lease with a company like Google. And then the county or city would ideally use the rest of the fiber for smart city type stuff, to do whatever it wanted to do, leasing it out to others under similar terms. And in that way, the county does not have to pay the full costs, but may still have a substantial cost depending on whether others want to use the network in a similar way. Consolidated has an approach in New England that I think is, I'll just share briefly, because Consolidated is not in the area of Tennessee, to my knowledge. And there's a ton of companies named Consolidated. This is the big incumbent company. Consolidated operates some in the Midwest and in New England. And they basically will get a sole lease, an exclusive lease of public municipal fiber. And then they will guarantee the debt payments that it costs to build that over that period, and make lease payments or some other kind of payment to the community, so that the community has probably a modest profit, or at the very least is fully covering its costs. This can be a rapid way to build because a company, if you have a deal like that with the incumbent telephone company, they can build very rapidly. However, it is not a way to introduce competition, most likely. So there are pros and cons to this, like anything else. Now, if you're going to pursue an arrangement like that, I like to note, and I use the example from Minnesota, which is a local company called CTC, a cooperative that has been terrific in its investments across Minnesota, particularly the more rural parts of Minnesota. They will strike a similar agreement as Consolidated would. And in fact, they would often, probably after 7 or 8 years, we expect that they will probably just make an offer to buy the fiber outright from the municipality. And we believe at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance that this is really a fundamentally different approach than working with a company like Consolidated, which is to say a big company that is probably publicly traded and has different incentives. Working with a community-oriented provider like a cooperative, they have decades of hopefully good management of putting local needs first, and not just wanting to figure out how to raise prices year after year to drive more revenue, to justify greater CEO salaries or greater dividends to shareholders. I don't say that because I think that that's an evil process. I have a 401k, I have investments in Vanguard, I understand the system. I'm just saying that there are certain practices one expects from a company that operates in that manner, and providing a high quality service 10 years from now at a reasonable price is not one that I think is where I'd put my money. So it's worth noting that there are different incentives for different partners, even if structurally the agreement looks very similar. Know the incentives of your provider and know that they diverge very significantly. We believe in municipal ownership and cooperative ownership as a first option because we have decades of evidence. In fact, for the electric municipalities, in many cases, more than 100 years of experience, that this meets local needs on an ongoing basis. It's not perfect. Some of them have corruption issues. Some of them don't do a perfect job. On the whole, they've done a much better job than the investor-owned competitors. So that's what's important. As they say, when you're camping, you don't have to run faster than the bear. You got to run faster than your buddy. So we're not saying that these systems are perfect, but they are better than the alternatives. Now, another model that is very similar, this is proceeding linearly if you ignore my last little side alley. In a situation where you are building the majority of fiber and then you are leasing that to a provider, it matters where you hand it off to them. Fort Morgan is an example in eastern Colorado, and they originally wanted to, I think, own the network all the way up to the side of the home. And they ultimately decided, I believe, to go down the alleyways. And so an ISP then has to do the drop. So conceptually, you can imagine that like an electric utility, the broadband utility, has a network pass that gets it close to every home. And then there's an additional cost to actually connect the homes. Who connects the homes will change how much competition you can expect on the network. That is what this model does. So don't get overwhelmed by this model, but you have here a distribution network that goes to the MST. The MST is the multi-port service terminal. You can immediately forget that if you want to. The important point is that that's where you then have to connect the home. If a provider has to connect the home, that means that there are hundreds of dollars more cost to the provider to connect each customer. That changes who is willing to compete on your network. I would say that in a network situation where you are partnered with a co-op, regardless of whether you open up the middle part of the network to other providers or not, the co-op is probably going to have all of the residential customers. No one is probably going to want to come in and compete with a co-op that's doing a good job. Now, Google Fiber uses this same model, and I frankly think I would not put money into competing with Google Fiber where they already have the customers because of that high cost of trying to get enough customers to justify your involvement in that market. But if Google Fiber's name turns to mud and nobody likes them anymore, then there will be an opportunity for competition. But if the network goes all the way to the home, where the cost of acquiring a customer is maybe just in the tens or low $100 to get a customer, then you might be you might see more competition on that local network. So I would say, don't worry about these details, but just understand that you should have expertise when you're negotiating this to have a sense of how what seem to be modest differences in the technical design could significantly change the outcome. If you are looking to have multi-service provider competition, the network design will matter as to whether or not you can achieve that. And there are people like Doug Dawson are the ones you'd want to hire or someone similar to him to make sure that you have a design that could work well. In the example of Utopia, this largest open access network in the United States, that's an arrangement where there's one network that is owned often by a public entity, but sometimes by a private company. They open the network to multiple competitors. That's what's called open access. One network, multiple companies using it to offer service. This is how we got online in the 90s using dial-up. We had one telephone network, and we had thousands of companies competing across the United States to connect people over their dial-up modems. That's what open access is. This is a shot of the many different ISPs that are available to people that are on that network in northern Utah. There's a different model that, a different technological model that achieves the same end of open access. And I'm sure Bill will share my slides. If he hasn't already, you can go back and watch this video if you'd like, in order to learn more about an alternative. This is one that is popping up in smaller towns as well. Depending on the technology, you might need to have many thousands of homes to lure multiple providers. And for some technology, you could get by with hundreds of homes and potentially have one or two providers that are competing. So the technology, again, will make a difference on how many ISPs you can attract. Finally, there's other approaches that may involve just getting conduit in the ground and then leasing that to different providers. West Des Moines, Iowa works with Google. That arrangement that I mentioned before, Google has been open to that. If you're closer to, I want to say Franklin County, I don't know the geography of much of Tennessee super well, but if you're on the adjacent to a area that is higher density, you may find that a Google or another private company is willing to do interesting things, doing extensive leases of conduit systems as part of their entry into that larger market. But Lincoln, Nebraska also did this and is doing it to more rural areas and across the entire county now. These are just a sense that there's a variety of ways you can move forward if, for some reason, the fiber network approach doesn't work for you. For instance, in Lincoln, Nebraska has a very tough restriction against municipal networks, like Tennessee, although Tennessee is not as bad as Nebraska. Lincoln said, all right, cool, we're not going to build a fiber network, which we're not allowed to do. We're just going to build a conduit system, and then we're going to lease the air in the conduit system. And if people want to put fiber into that, that's their business. But we're gonna build a conduit system and lease that, and the state did not have a restriction against that. So that is, this can be a regulatory runaround as well to avoid the kind of regulations that some of the big companies have put into place to restrict investment and competition. This is a paper that will be useful if you are particularly interested in low-income solutions. There are challenges for meeting low-income needs. The challenges of meeting apartment building needs are far less. It is much easier to meet the needs of people that are in apartment buildings who are all low income than it is to meet dispersed single family homes that are in poverty. And so this is a solution for how San Francisco did it, but this is something that can be done in a lot of places. It simply talks about the economics of doing multi-dwelling unit, multi-tenant environments, fancy ways of saying condos and apartment buildings. And the economics of that are often reasonable to connect even low-income folks that don't have a lot of money each month. With that, we can go on to the Q&A, and it's not even as over as I normally am.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. And could you talk a little bit more about the Ammon model, where they people opt into being taxed for this?
Sure. Ammon is the slide that I showed with the video that is an alternative open access in which they use I would say a more recent technology called software-defined networking. And so the approach in Ammon is unique for two reasons. The second reason is what Bill just mentioned. The first one is the technology allows different providers to compete and do more innovative things that, frankly, we don't know yet what that is. This is still developing. As we have 1 million customers that have access to this technology, we'll have a better sense of what it can do. But many of us think that it's very promising. But the thing about Ammon that has revolutionized the financing of these networks is that they have broken it out so that the community does not take on the risk of financing the network. The network is paid for by each user that wants to get on it. So if you're connecting a neighborhood in a more urban area, it might cost you $1,500 or $2,000 to connect each home that is going to be on the network. In Ammon's case, a homeowner could pay that upfront, or they could finance it over 20 years and make a payment on the order of $20 a month for 20 years. And they'll end up, paying more. Obviously, that's how mortgages work and long-term financing works, but it's a reasonable cost. When you take out the cost of building the network, the cost of service goes through the floor. So in Ammon's case, there are 3 fees that one has to pay to participate in the network. One of those fees can be paid off and disappears entirely. The other 2 fees are forever. So the first fee we talked about, which is how do you get connected to the network? You either pay that up front or you turn that into a stream of fees over time. And the second fee is a maintenance fee. You make sure that that network keeps working. That's your share of fixing breaks in the line and upgrading routers and technology and that sort of a thing. That's about $16.50 per month right now. That will decline over time as the network grows. So if you have paid up front, like I would if I was an Ammon, I would have wrote that check for $2,000 immediately. My cost would be $16.50 a month, plus whatever service tier I wanted. Right now, a gigabit is going for, I believe, $10 a month. And so my total monthly bill would be basically $25, $26 a month for a gigabit service to my home, having made the investment. Or if I was making that $20, $25 monthly payment, it would still be on the order of $50 a month for a gigabit, which is among the lowest rates in the nation. So when you take the risk out of the network, you actually do some really interesting things. It is a little bit more complicated to set up, and you need to make sure that you have a sufficient interest in the network. If 20% of people want to do this, the costs aren't going to work out like that. If you have 60% of people who want to do it, then it can work out. We also see a similar model like this in Washington State, where they have public utility districts that operate like cooperatives, and they build these models on demand. The most costly one was on the order of tens of thousands of dollars per home. People still paid it. It was a wealthier area west of Seattle where they really wanted it. But in some areas, you could be creative with financing where you put it on the shoulders of the people who really want it, and they pay the cost of it rather than someone having to go to the market to borrow money at a significant interest rate for the business model. A benefit of this model, if it works for you, and I don't know Tennessee law well enough to know whether a change in the law would be required to do it, A real benefit of this is that once you've done that, if a homeowner has paid $2,000, or in a more rural area, it might be $3,500 or $4,000. Commonly, as you get really remote, it might be $5,000 or $10,000, per home. So these costs will vary based on the density. But once a homeowner is either making that stream of payments or has made that one-time investment, if some rival company comes up and says, "I'll cut your monthly bill," it's going to fall on deaf ears, because the person's bought in to the network that they're a part of. And so there's a certainty that also comes with this model. But I think that one has to have a lot of trust in the community, which is more true of, Ammon is a heavily Mormon area. There's a lot of social cohesion. So I would say that I would not expect this necessarily to work just anywhere, but in places where people trust their neighbors, they feel a sense of community and that sort of a thing.
Chris, some of the partnership models is essentially the community writes a check to help subsidize the provider investment. Can you talk about some of the options where communities can get additional benefits for those dollars as you begin to negotiate that partnership?
Yes, I think so. There's a variety of ways. One is, depending on the partner you're working with, if the community writes a check, I would say if you're working with a cooperative, you should be talking about whether the customers of the network are members of the cooperative. And we've seen different arrangements from cooperatives that will make the new customers members immediately. And some cooperatives plan to never make them members. And some cooperatives plan to make them members after they have sufficiently paid off the cost of connecting that area. So if the cooperative is extending, $150,000 to connect the area, once they feel that in the monthly fees they've made that $150,000 back, then they would extend membership. I think it's very important for cooperatives to be governed by their members and to not set up an arrangement where you have two tiers and where you have people that are served by a cooperative and the cooperative does not feel like those people are members of it. So I would say that if you're putting public money in, you should have a discussion with a cooperative about about how membership could work in the future, because we're thinking about how to do this in 3 to 5 years. We need to be also thinking about what happens 80 years from now. This is a permanent infrastructure. The networks that are built now in more rural areas are what the children will be using of the children who have not yet been born, right? We're talking about 30, 40 years from now, people will be using the network that is being built with this money that is being distributed in the next few years. So that's one piece of it. For companies that are not cooperatives, where you might be, where there's no membership option, I think having some stake in discussion about any change of ownership, right of first refusal to buy the network, for instance, could be a piece of it, or to buy the local infrastructure if it's a larger arrangement. I think having approval over price increases. I don't like bringing price increases into politics. But I do like having price increases somewhat subject to democratic forces. That's not as much of a contradiction as it might seem immediately. We don't want it in the day-to-day politics. So if I was an ISP negotiating with a community, I would not want to say price increases are subject to county or city approval. However, that could be a part of the negotiation. You could see some sort of number of accounts where you might say, we're going to put in this amount of money, and we want you to serve 100 homes that we designate with a low-cost service. Or we want you to provide a low-cost service to everyone who qualifies under this metric. We've seen that in numerous public-private partnerships. You may also say, we're going to work with you to establish a philanthropic arrangement where it's going to help cover your costs. If there's a lot of costs associated with serving low-income populations, we're going to work with local philanthropy, and we're going to set up some sort of make it easy for the community to help contribute. Those are all different things that we could see along those lines. But Bill, I don't know if there's any other arrangements that I'm missing. You've had a lot of experience with this, and I don't know if something was in your mind that I missed.
Well, one of those would be around the idea of dark fiber access, that if they're want to do smart community things, that they would have access to a certain number of strands to connect public buildings or streetlights or pumping stations or all those kind of things.
Yeah, so it would probably be unreasonable to ask for a separate strand to connect every home, but it would be entirely feasible to ask for some number of public locations to be connected, as well as access to a ring that would be built that would give you some flexibility. You could ask for a spare conduit to be placed in which you could put any number of fibers in the future. You would have a negotiation over whether that conduit and that fiber would be able to be competitive with the original provider. In many cases, they're going to want to have a non-competitive agreement on that. I would resist that in the sense that it's not unlikely that you work with someone that you like, they get bought out by someone who's more regional and good, and then they get bought out by a national private equity firm. And then you have, this is all happening within 5 years. You have a new business park that's coming to the area, and you don't like the prices they're going to be trying to charge that business park. And you want to make sure that you can connect that business park with the assets that you have to make sure you're very attractive for industry or commercial. And if you have an agreement that you will not compete with them, then you are really stuck not being able to do that. So, you could put a period of exclusivity on it, but I would try to think that over the longer term, you want to make sure that you have full access to those additional resources to use however you please. Don't just accept non-commercial access to the new infrastructure that you would get as part of that partnership.
Good, thanks, Chris.
Yep.
Questions from the audience?
Monroe County has a question.
Good.
Okay, so thank you so much for sharing with us today. You, in the process of you sharing, you shared that it actually costs more to lay electric lines than it does fiber lines. We've actually met with our electric cooperative several times, and they completed a feasibility study on actually expanding broadband fiber to all of their customers, and they found that it wouldn't be financially feasible for them at all. Is this something that we should encourage them to revisit because maybe the costs have changed since they completed that feasibility study? What would be your advice?
No, and I would say that what they're saying is not contradictory of what I'm saying. To be able to provide electricity on the infrastructure that was built many decades ago, when there was no environmental permitting, when there was when the poles were brand new and things like that, at that point the costs were lower. My comparison is more that if we're talking about building out to a new subdivision, for instance, in a given area or a new home, the cost of building a new fiber network or a new electric network, the cost is going to be lower to build a new fiber network. The cost of electricity is just more expensive because you have more components and it is more dangerous. You need more highly trained crews in a lot of ways. So to answer the question that you're asking, I think that's more important is, from what we see, electric cooperatives can build to on the order of like 4 paying customers per linear mile, more or less, without subsidy. There's a lot, and in Tennessee, it's not going to be true. Like that's probably more true in the Midwest where there's lower costs. In Tennessee, where you have higher costs, probably 6 or 7 homes per linear mile. Now, beyond that, they may need a subsidy. However, that's, over the next 4 years, the state of Tennessee is going to be giving out those subsidies specifically for this issue. We see electric cooperatives saying that it is not financially viable because there may be, that might be an area that is particularly high cost, right? So, when I say 6 or 7 miles, homes paying per mile, that is an average across thousands of homes. So if we're talking about the area that's not, the higher cost of that area, then yes, they might need a substantial amount of money from a program like Reconnect, which is a federal program, or through the state's funds that it will be distributing under the BEAD program. I think the other thing that I would say is that electric cooperatives, there's 800 of them, and more than 200 of them are offering broadband fiber service today. Some, additional number are going to be getting into it in the near term. We think probably another 100, 150, maybe 200. So that means half of the electric cooperatives today will never get into fiber broadband, we think. Some of them, it's they don't want to do it. They just see it as intimidating or too much of a risk. and I don't know their territories. For some number of them, it's also a factor that's playing into it is that if you have a general manager who is 63 years old, is preparing to retire soon, it is not really responsible to engage in a 5 or 6 year massive project that is one of the 3 or 4 biggest projects a cooperative has ever taken on when you're planning on stepping down soon. So a lot of general managers and boards have these sorts of issues where they're not sure about continuity of leadership right now. We see that the cooperatives that have stepped up to do more are often ones where they've had a leadership transition and they've brought in someone specifically who knows that this is a task they need to do, and that's a part of the goal. Now, the last thing that is related to that pops into my head is that there's 2 electric cooperatives that I know of specifically where the general manager and the board said, no, we're not doing fiber. We don't even care what the numbers are. We're not going to do it. It's not our thing. New Hampshire Electric Cooperative and Delta Montrose in the western slope of Colorado. In both cases, local businesses came to the next meeting of the board and said, as well as residents, we think that this is so important. We're going to organize a campaign to change the board. We are going to run people against the board. We're going to put money into a campaign, and we're going to make this an issue. In the case of New Hampshire Electric Cooperative, they wanted to change the bylaws. They needed 65% of a vote of the membership. They got 63%. So they failed. I don't know what just happened. I don't know if I blinked there, but my screens went off. So I mean, my mouse hadn't moved long enough. My computer got tired. So in New Hampshire Electric Cooperative, they didn't get the 63%. The board and the general manager saw the writing on the wall. The manager started looking for new positions. The board ended up changing. I think 2 members stepped down that were implacably opposed to it. And they are now building that network in New Hampshire. Delta Montrose, similarly, they had an election, 2 board members shifted, and the rest of the board got religion on it, and Delta Montrose is moving forward aggressively to build the network. So at the same time, I forget the name of it, but Central Virginia, not Central Virginia Electric, but another one near there, I think it was Rappahannock, they had a campaign, a grassroots campaign, and the board opposed it, and then ultimately did, I think, form a partnership, but like the grassroots campaign was not successful in really changing the board's name, the board's opposition to building their own network. So grassroots opposition can change perception of the numbers. I think you need to understand whether you're dealing with like a political resistance or if it actually is the numbers. If it's the numbers, then that's what the Reconnect program is there for. I mean, Reconnect may pay tens of thousands of dollars per home to get people connected in the highest cost areas.
Tracy, we have a question from you, I see.
I'm not able to hear it.
No, me either. Tracy, do you have a question?
It looks like you're speaking, but
You're muted, Tracy.
Here we go.
There we go.
Here. Okay, the cooperative that was put together, the broadband cooperative, did that come under the rural utility service, or is that a standalone cooperative separate from us?
it is a standalone cooperative, and they were not an attractive funding option from Russ. In fact, the co-op bank, what's it called? CoBank was not even supportive of funding them. And this is an area this is where co-ops came from in the United States. Like, I mean, this is Renville County, which, I mean, they have co-ops for everything. And so they were really frustrated and had a bit of a chip on their shoulder. They had to build it freestanding, and some of the existing grain ag co-ops in the area put money into it to help it get up. But they did not find, and I think it's because the electric and telephone co-ops didn't really like the model. And so they like things the way they are. They're naturally resistant to change. So the RS Fiber Co-op came about through real local efforts, and at this point may be in better graces with the history of like the federal apparatus. But they really had to work at it. And I'll just note that in their case, the communities came together to provide seed funding as well. So the communities basically passed a bond, and they each put up a significant amount to raise $7.5 million, I believe, to help seed the funding for the fiber network. The broadband cooperative owns the fiber network, but it is not itself a service provider. For that, it partnered with a local private company that has a very good reputation. And the cooperative then actually was not able to make the first loan payments, which was not unanticipated. And so people's taxes went up temporarily to cover the gap. And the expectation is over time, the co-op will actually pay that money back as it is fully able to achieve its business plan.
Okay, this is at Renville, is that right?
Yeah, it's RS is for Renville, Sibley counties, two counties.
I've been in Renville. I've been there. I know. Yeah, I've been to co-ops there.
Yeah.
So it's almost all of Sibley County, and it's just the eastern portion of Renville.
Okay, and then they couldn't even go to CoBank and get funded. Then is that correct?
That's correct. CoBank, I think, didn't view them as a real co-op until they had established more, and viewed them as too risky, I think, at that point. So that's why they had to tap local funds. At this point, I don't know. Under different arrangements, CoBank might have a different response depending on local politics and things like that. So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily how it would go today.
And the rural utility service is known as a very, they like you to have reserves in the bank for as much money as you're trying to borrow. And certainly a startup cooperative asking to borrow millions doesn't really fit their loan criteria. So that's a real challenge for them.
And there's one additional issue that they faced for Russ, which was that a local telephone company, which had neglected to upgrade its facilities. It was a local company, but I would say was not run in the most responsible manner. They had an outstanding loan for telecommunications equipment that they had not finished paying off. And Russ has a policy of never offering funding in an area where it has an existing loan. So that also got in the way for Russ.
Good, thank you. Any other questions? Chris, thank you so much. That was a lot to digest. I know our communities each week, Doug spoke a little while ago, and it's a whirlwind of information. So, one of the things that we do in this program is to put our presentation archives online. So people can take a little time, wait a few days, go back and look at it again, fast forward to the places that you can, what you're really looking to review. I would encourage you to go to Chris's website, which is rich with little videos and studies and so on, and be able to look at those at your leisure going forward with your discussions. As we think about forming partnerships, we've got a little worksheet that you're free to use in your discussions. And Reed, are you able to make that available for folks?
Yeah, I've sent it to the team leaders and also the community liaisons, so everyone should have it.
Thank you. And so basically, and some communities are kind of set with their providers, but I would encourage you to spend at least a few minutes with this worksheet to kind of look at the strengths and weaknesses of those different ownership models, but in particular about what kind of things that you can bring to a partnership, whether that's conduit, right-of-way, existing dark fiber, your own telephone communications needs, right? The county government, if they say, hey, if you build it, we'll be your customer, that's a positive thing for a provider. So you're just paying for your telecom services, but you're providing cash flow to that business. So that's really encourage you to go through that worksheet and use it as you can. Otherwise, it's just the surveys now. We had said earlier they're going to close like last Friday. They're open now till Sunday night. And then on Monday morning, Dave will send you a count, and then shortly after send you reports. And I know he's got a deadline that will happen early in the week because he's got some business travel later in the week. So he's going to be a busy guy on Monday and Tuesday getting your surveys. I need to meet with Claiborne and Monroe about the dates for your community meetings. So I'll be stopping around and we'll try and hammer those out. And essentially those two meetings again, we meet, we won't have our weekly meetings those weeks, but we will be meeting individually with the communities and go through kind of what have we learned and what are we going to do about it. And so that's about it. So with that, I encourage you to meet as long as you need to, and you know what work you have to do, provider interviews and so on. And then next week we have our state or our local financing powers, and I've seen the slides already. They look excellent in terms of the content for what they're going to present. It's a little complicated, so it's going to be interesting to hear about that, but at least once again, identify another resource for you to follow up with for your particular situation.
Hey, Bill, it's Tracy. For the 26th and the 2nd, when we're doing kind of the group meetings, will it be different Teams, Zoom numbers? Or are we still going to use, because everyone's been
Yeah.
getting the information.
And I've already sent those now to Bedford and
Roan.
Rome, thank you.
Okay.
So yeah,
Okay.
team leaders should have those.
Okay.
My brain turns off under pressure, so it's always better 6 hours later. So
Thank you.
yeah. Any other questions? Good. And Chris, the answer is certainly yes. So I'll send you the link to that. And you can actually look at all the content, you know. You can go through our program yourself, and
We're going to be bringing some new people on board before too long, I hope, and this is great stuff to get them up and going.
good. I'll send you that link.
Thank you, Chris. I'll be in touch.
Thanks so much,
Bye,
Chris.
everyone.
Pleasure.
All right. Reed, you can send